Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Adam Watson. I'm an agriculture agent with the University of Tennessee here in Washington County. Tonight, we're going to be talking about grape pruning. So with grapes, our goals with pruning are very similar to other fruit pruning we do, whether in the orchard or with our cane berries. We're looking to direct growth to be more fruitful, have better harvest and better quality of harvest by reducing disease pressure. So that's why we tackle this topic and why we're looking at it tonight. Tonight, if I happen to mention any brand or trade names of products, please understand that's not an endorsement by myself nor with the university. Additionally, I'll remind you if we were to be mentioning any sort of pesticide products that the label is the law and nothing I say will supersede what the label says. To get a little better acquainted this evening, I thought we'd touch on a few of the pruning terms you're going to hear me use. So a very important one is a cane. In reference to tonight's presentations, it's going to be last year's growth that has now matured now that we're to dormant season pruning. So it's a 1-year-old vine, essentially, or we refer to it as a cane. We'll also mention cordons. Cordons are permanent horizontal branches, essentially, of a grapevine. One note to keep in mind as we go through tonight, where does fruiting happen on grapes? Unlike many of our other fruits, grapes actually fruit on current season's growth. And what I mean by that is, for instance, apples. Apples will set floral buds the season prior, and then those bloom in year 2. With grapes, we actually have new growth that happens in the spring, and it's on that new growth that floral buds develop. And so they fruit on new growth, which means we can approach pruning in a radically different manner if we're not having to preserve that fruiting wood. So keep that in mind. We'll also be talking about spurs, and in fact, we'll have 2 basic philosophies on pruning. We'll call them cane pruning and spur pruning. And just understand that with spur pruning, as we go through, you will see that we have permanently established spurs that we leave from year to year. And that'll make more sense in a few minutes. And also keep in mind, regardless of pruning system, we still have a trunk, which our grapevine, that is our main vine coming up from the ground to our structure that we're growing on. There are scenarios where we can have a double trunk, and oftentimes, especially in the backyard, we only have a single trunk. Either is acceptable, but just be aware of that. One thing to be aware of and why we are talking about pruning grapes now rather than 6 weeks ago is that when we are dormant pruning grapes, we are stimulating those buds to break and grow. So right now, to the best of my knowledge, what I've seen, grapes are still dormant, but in a couple of weeks, that's not going to be the case. So I would encourage you to go ahead and look at doing your dormant pruning now. You see there depicted in the picture, left we have dormant buds, right we have those buds that are beginning to break and grow. And so because our pruning can stimulate this growth, we don't want to be too early when we prune grapes. If we are a little late, if they are already breaking buds, we could have some weeping from our vines as we're cutting them. Still not going to destroy the plant, and certainly I would much prefer a late pruning as opposed to no pruning at all. So just be aware, we still want to prune while dormant, but we don't want to be too early with our efforts to prevent winter injury. This was a statement I ran across, and it's from Don't Be Timid When Pruning Grapes. If I remember correctly, this was actually a blog posting. But essentially, and I've highlighted the key takeaway, the concern that we have with homeowners of grapes is that generally gardeners fail to remove enough of last year's growth. And so, in fact, in many instances, we're going to be removing 90%, maybe even more, of last year's growth each and every season. That's dramatic. I don't know of any other plant Certainly not in the fruiting realm that we would do that to and expect a good harvest. But again, where does that fruiting occur on grapes? Last year's growth or current season's growth? It's the current season's growth. So when we remove last year's growth, we're not taking away anything from this year's harvest. And in fact, because we have those same basic goals that we see with other fruit pruning of opening up, increasing air infiltration, allowing sunlight to come in to reduce wet surfaces, which are directly encouraging to diseases. If we fail to prune enough, we're creating conditions that are going to favor disease, for instance. And so make sure you're not afraid to remove the vast majority of last year's growth. That's the only way to correctly prune grapes. All right, so what we have here, this image just demonstrates the sort of density of new growth that we're looking at whenever we are finished with pruning. So tonight I'm not going to talk a lot about thinning, but this grapevine has been thinned. So there are about 4 shoots per linear foot of, in this instance, cordon or horizontal vine. About a week prior to this, there were actually more shoots than this present. But once we have new spring growth, we are going to go in and thin those some because we'll actually have more growth than we want. We'll have excessive growth that is conducive to creating wet conditions, not allowing good wind penetration or sunlight to encourage drying. So we will actually come back and thin these after our dormant pruning once we've had growth and we can see just what new growth we have available to us. So again, not really a focus tonight because what I find most of the time with home gardeners is we don't have a good system in place that allows us to effectively prune. And so what I want to talk about more tonight is establishing grapes either from when we're planting or if we've had grapes established, maybe remediating those back to a system that allows us to do a good job with pruning. And so with that, let's talk about the 2 systems we'll be discussing tonight with a little more detail. So there's cane pruning and there's spur pruning. Generally speaking, we see spur pruning more associated with wine type grapes. And we see more cane, and generally those are European varietals. And generally cane pruning we see more associated with American grapes, things like Concord, but also the American French hybrids. And so in truth, you could prune any grape to either system. You might be losing a little bit of productivity if you spur prune one that would prefer to be cane pruned, but it's not going to kill the plant. So just understand that, while there are sort of rules of thumb, we can see instances of either system. The big difference, and it's significant, but at the same time, it's pretty minimal, is that with spur pruning, we're establishing cordons. And cordons are those horizontal vines that are running across our trellis or other structure. Those horizontals with cordon pruning or spur pruning is permanent. We establish those, we get the length we want, and then we just maintain them. The cane pruning, however, each year, we're establishing new horizontals from last year's growth. And so hopefully here in a few minutes when we start looking at some pictures, that difference will stand out to you. But it's both simple but also significant on that difference. But let's talk about what's similar between both systems. So early on when we're just establishing a vine, so whenever we're planting a grape, we are going to want to reduce that plant to a single shoot with 3 buds. So a lot, and similar with some of our other fruiting practices, our other plants that we have, where when we establish them, we want to kind of start with a blank slate. And so we cut it back to a single shoot with 3 buds. Once those buds have started growing and are maybe about 1 foot in length, we select one of those to be a trunk. We want it to be well-growing, upright, vigorous. And we want to take caution that it's not coming from the roots, because especially if we are trying to grow one of the European varietals, for instance, it is almost certainly grown on a rootstock. It's grafted. And so you don't want to grow a grape that you think is one thing and it actually be the rootstock that you're growing. So we select one. This would also be a scenario where you could select two trunks. That's a valid option. But in either case, you're going to tie the trunk loosely at the top and bottom of a stake to begin with. And as it's growing, you're going to make sure, one, that those ties aren't too tight, that you're not cutting into that vine, into that trunk. And you're going to move it up to support it, because we're not trying to keep this rigidly attached to a support. So we don't want to stake it and then tape it down or tie it down tightly. We want there to be some movement. That's perfectly fine. We just don't want extreme movement. We want to hold that growth up so it keeps growing upward. Grow tubes can work well for this. So if you purchase your grape and they come with grow tubes, great. If you have grow tubes around, and those are just cylindrical tubes, generally of polycarbonate material, that work to help protect, but also encourage that upright growth. Let's say we get to the end of the season, or we get to where our growth just is not happening. It's not a happy plant. It didn't establish well. Maybe it got planted at the wrong time, or any number of reasons. If we don't have good vines to select a trunk from, what we would wait is until the next dormant season period, so about now or a little bit earlier, and we'd basically start the process over. Cut it back to a single shoot with 3 buds and try to reestablish a good trunk. Because this trunk is critical to have a quality trunk there, because it is what's going to allow that plant to grow and thrive for years. So it's worth delaying one season if we don't have a quality trunk grown, rather than have something that's going to be problematic in the future. So just understand, if things don't turn out well, we can do a do-over. But probably if it fails that second time, it's probably worth replanting rather than trying to continue with something that's suboptimal. What about a year later, that first dormant pruning? So there's basically a couple of things that could be happening. We'll look at 3 scenarios and how we would treat each one of those. So the first one is our trunk just reaches or is slightly taller than our bottom wire on our trellis. And I do mention wire trellises because honestly, they're cost effective, they're long lasting, and they work well. Certainly there are grapes grown on arbors and other type structures, but I'll be referring typically to that trellising structure as a wire, because I think if we are purposely establishing a trellis, wire trellises work well for what we need. So what we do if we have that trunk that's just reached that bottom wire is we will look at tying it to that bottom wire and then removing the top bud. At the same time, we'll also remove any laterals, and those are just branches that are coming off of that trunk. If we have a very strongly growing trunk and it's above that bottom wire, what we will do is cut that to a length of 4 to 5 buds above that bottom wire. Then we'll bend down that section, tie it to the wire, and we'll remove the laterals again. If we have the scenario where we have a tremendously, amazingly growing trunk, it has many very vigorous side branches, and some of those are above the bottom wire, we might be able to go ahead and establish our horizontal branches or cordons, whether they be cane or cordons. So in this scenario, after one season, we might be able to establish those. If we do, we choose the 2 closest laterals to that bottom wire. We prune those to 3 to 5 buds in length, and then we tie it to the bottom wire. The top trunk, we top just above the bottom wire. Again, because in this scenario, we still want all our growth now to go in those horizontals and not with more upward growth. So again, 3 scenarios. Now, to put that, I know that's a lot of words. So to put that into a little better context, here is an image that relates those 3 scenarios. The first A being the topping with lateral removal for a slightly taller plant, a very vigorous plant where we reduce the length of that trunk, tie it to the horizontal wire and remove the laterals. And then lastly, an extremely vigorous trunk that we're able to go ahead and establish our horizontal branching. So those are kind of the 3 scenarios we could have. And they're all equally well. And what you will find if you plant different varieties of grapes, they're not going to all grow at the same rate. So you could have this same scenario with different grapes, and it certainly not be an indication that plant A is not growing as well as plant C, for instance. Some varieties are more vigorous than others. So what about our second year dormant pruning? So except for scenario C, this is where we really start establishing our horizontals. So what we do is we're going to be looking at the canes that grew. Again, at this point, they are 1 year old because we pruned off all the laterals at the last dormant pruning. So we're going to select 2 canes, one going on either direction of the plant, about 3 to 5 feet in length. And we want their diameter to be about 1/3 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch. And those are what we are going to establish our permanent horizontal cordons from, or our cane pruning structures. So this is one where we are, regardless of system, this step is the same. We're selecting out, again, those well-formed canes, which is just 1 year old wood, to establish our horizontals. Don't be tempted if you have some very large diameter canes to use those to establish your horizontals, because those can actually be less productive in the long run. Same thing when we have very small laterals. Look at that size, about 1/3 of an inch to a little less than 1/2 of an inch. That's the size we want to use. They're vigorous, they're well established, but they're not too large or too small. And then we're just going to go ahead and tie those to our wire trellis. So under both systems, we were doing this. The only time this doesn't happen in that second year dormant pruning is because we have those established in that first year dormant pruning because of a super vigorous plant. So this is where we establish our horizontals. So spur pruning, we have cordons. Cane pruning, we don't. What do I mean by that? On the left, we have cane. On the right, we have spur. And the difference, it's small, but it's significant. Because looking at those two, you see they're very different. So what is the same between these? So let me grab my laser pointer. So what we see is all this growth up here, this lighter color growth on this one, and all this lighter color growth on this one. That is all last year's growth. That is what we would refer to now as being canes, because it's 1 year old at the time of this picture. So last year at dormant pruning time, that did not exist on the plant. What did exist were the horizontals, and let me point those out. So on the cordon side, we have this much larger horizontal. We have what we refer to as spurs above it. This is not a young cordon. We know that because of the size and the complexity, the gnarliness, so to speak, of those spurs. This is an older plant. If we look to the horizontal here, what do we see? We actually see a plant that is not old. And that's because at the time of this picture, that is literally basically 2 years old, more or less. It was left and established as a horizontal last year from a 1 year old cane. If we look closely over here, we see some canes that would be ideal candidates to reestablish our horizontals for the new season. And we'll take a look at that over the next couple of pictures. So here we have a cane pruning example. Don't think it's necessarily the same one we had a moment ago, but the principles are still the same. We have our horizontals that are now 2 years old, but because it's a cane, we're going to remove those. So the first thing we do when pruning this for the new season, the dormant pruning, is just to remove our horizontals and all the associated growth. When we do that, we end up with something like this. And I don't believe this is the same vine necessarily. So in this case, we have 2 trunks, again, acceptable, but not necessary. And what they have done is a couple of things. They have left some of these long canes that were originating from, and don't let this term mess you up, but renewal spurs. So renewal spurs are just short little stubs, essentially, that we leave to grow long canes to establish next year's horizontals in cane pruning. So what do we do once we have our old growth removed? We then establish our new horizontals. What you will note if you look closely, there are a few little stubs here. That is not accidental. Those stubs are pruned to where there's a couple of buds on them, maybe 3. And the purpose of those is to allow for next year's horizontals to be grown. So we are doing that to encourage replacement canes for our horizontals for the next season. Because next season that dormant pruning is going to look like this. We'll then remove these horizontals and their associated growth. And we'll have these renewal canes growing from the little renewal spurs or little stubs we left that will select out the new horizontals. So this is a great depiction of just how much you remove on a plant. So we basically remove almost all of last year's growth except for the 2 horizontals and a few very short little renewal spurs that are going to grow next year's horizontals for us. So that's cane pruning. And again, cane pruning is about not establishing a permanent horizontal branch, but actually renewing those horizontals each and every dormant pruning. That's what differentiates cane pruning from spur pruning. What about spur pruning? Okay, same time, we're back to a dormant pruning. So this time of year, what do? Well, again, we basically remove everything that grew last year, except on our spurs. So on these smaller little projections here, we're leaving 2 to 3 buds that are going to allow for this new season's growth. So you can see here where we have all our growth that happened last year originating from these spurs. Those same exact spurs are going to have the growth originating again this year. So our horizontal remains in place. It's going to be getting older. The spurs are going to be getting larger and gnarlier with each season because those remain there. We do not reestablish our horizontals each season. That's what distinguishes spurs. We're pruning back to spurs that are a couple of buds remaining, and that's where our new growth originates from. Again, take a consideration, permanently established horizontal, newly established horizontal at dormant pruning each and every season. Big difference, significant difference, but functionally each one is performing the same exact job for the plant. Just how old is that horizontal? What happens if we've got damage? So especially when we have cordons, those permanently established horizontal branches, we can have issues where they become unfruitful for us. So what do? Well, luckily we can actually, for this dormant pruning, almost act like either one, it's a new cordon trained or spur trained plant. So we're reestablishing that horizontal, or we act like we're going to prune it as if it were a cane prune plant. Because what we're doing is we're reestablishing a new horizontal. So we can see on this example, we have a tremendous amount of this horizontal that is not fruiting. How do I know that? Is there any new growth along this section? No, there's not. And so no new growth means no fruit, because fruit buds, flower buds happen on this season's growth. There is no new growth there, so there is no fruiting. So because of that, we've got to get rid of this old cordon that is either damaged, diseased, and replace it with something new. So to do that, we're just going to act as though it were a cane pruned grape from the beginning. So what we'll do is we'll remove anything that is old. We'll remove most of last year's new growth, with the exception of one horizontal that we reestablish our horizontal growth with. So the next year, we've got an option. We can either just allow this horizontal to be permanent and just go back to spur pruning, or if we don't like this horizontal, or if there's an issue again, we can try to reestablish in exactly the same process. So we do have the ability to rejuvenate cordons if they become damaged, diseased, or otherwise not producing for us. When we do that, essentially, we are utilizing the same steps as we would in a typical cane pruning dormant time pruning. So I do have a video clip that I'm going to refer you to so as to not run afoul of copyright infringement issues with YouTube. It's by Penn State. So most of the images from this presentation actually came from a Penn State publication that I think is tremendous for backyard growers. So I'm actually going to link that in the comments. If you're attending this, you'll actually get it in the email I send you with resources. But I encourage you to take a look at this pruning video. It's about 6 minutes in length. There's about a 2.5-minute section that basically summarizes everything that I went over. But what's great about it is you see live in practice someone actually pruning both spur type as well as cane type grapes live. So you see just how much material is actually being removed and what is left behind. So pictures are great, but I think the video is instructive. So I'm going to encourage you to take a look at that.